Joe McNamara has spent years learning how to control dangerous situations, but episode May 3rd be the moment where that control starts slipping away. After the chaos of the Ukraine operation and the attack on Joe's home, the Lioness team finally has a chance to sit down with the woman they believe could be responsible for exposing Joe, Alexandra Balakin. But instead of giving them a simple answer, Balakin opens a door to something much bigger. And by the end of the episode, Joe makes a decision that could explain exactly why she's being tortured in the present timeline. This episode, titled The Bear is Infected, slows the action down considerably. There aren't as many shootouts or large-scale operations as we've seen so far. Instead, the episode is built around interrogation, intelligence, manipulation, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations. And honestly, that works. Because sometimes the most dangerous scene in Lioness isn't somebody pulling a trigger. It's somebody sitting across a table and deciding what information they're willing to reveal. Balakin is finally in the room. The episode opened 6 months earlier in Kiev. Delta Force operators Cody J. and Grady arrive at a home looking for Olga Balakin. They force their way inside, and we quickly understand that this is a friendly visit. Balakin's family is being held at gunpoint elsewhere, giving the CIA something to use as leverage. Back in the United States, Kyle begins questioning Alexandra, and immediately, Balakin starts defending herself. The central question is simple. Did she give the Russians Joe's home address? Balakin says no. She insists she's not Russian. When Kyle calls her a Russian, she becomes furious enough to physically attack him. It's a small moment, but it tells us something about her. She's not behaving like someone who is calmly accepting the accusation. She's angry, she's scared, and she's desperate to convince the CIA that they have the wrong person. For the moment, Kyle and Cruz aren't completely convinced she's lying. But Kyle isn't ready to let her off the hook. He tells her there will be another round of questioning. And considering what happens later, that warning turns out to be important. Joe wants to hear it herself. Kyle and Cruz take what they've learned back to Joe, Kaitlyn Meade, and Byron Westfield. Their conclusion is that Balakin probably didn't expose Joe. But Joe isn't satisfied with simply accepting the team's assessment. She wants to hear Balakin's story herself. That's classic Joe. She doesn't like making major decisions based entirely on somebody else's interpretation. So she sits down with Balakin. And this is where the episode really changes direction. Because instead of simply answering questions, Balakin makes Joe an offer. And that offer becomes a foundation for everything Joe does afterward. Balakin isn't just a potential source anymore. She may be a doorway into something much bigger. The Russian connection is much deeper. The team eventually regroups at the farm. Amber Whalen joins the conversation, and Balakin starts revealing just how much Russian intelligence knows about the CIA's operations. One of the most concerning revelations involves the old Lioness operation against Al-Zarqawi. Balakin knows details about it. That means Russian intelligence isn't simply aware of Joe. They have information about the Lioness program itself. And that's a completely different level of threat. The team has spent years operating under the assumption that secrecy protects them. But if the Russians have been collecting information on previous operations, then Joe's team may have been exposed for much longer than they realized. And Balakin isn't finished. She explains how Russian intelligence builds relationships with assets inside the United States. This is where the episode starts feeling less like a traditional spy thriller and more like a warning about how easily influence can spread. Because the Russians don't necessarily need to send somebody into the country with a weapon. They can build relationships. They can recruit people. They can gain access. They can wait. And eventually, those relationships can become more valuable than any weapon. Balakin has a list. Then comes one of the biggest reveals of the episode. Balakin gives the team a packet. Inside is a list of Russian assets operating inside the United States. That sounds like the breakthrough Joe has been waiting for. Except there's a catch. These aren't insignificant people. They're sitting United States senators. 5 of them. That's an enormous problem. Because now the CIA isn't dealing with a handful of spies hiding somewhere overseas. They're dealing with people who already have political influence inside the United States. And that's exactly the kind of situation that can become impossible to control. But Balakin herself is still in danger. Her SVR cover hasn't been completely exposed. If the Russians discover who she really is, what she's done, and how much information she's given the CIA, she could disappear without leaving a trace. Balakin knows this. Joe knows this. And that puts Joe in a difficult position. Does she pull Balakin out? Does she burn her cover? Or does she leave her in place because she can still provide information that the CIA desperately needs? Kyle explains why they can't simply remove her. The situation is too valuable. And that's where the moral problem begins. Joe makes a dangerous decision. Joe chooses to let Balakin remain in place. And looking at the present timeline, that decision becomes incredibly uncomfortable. Because we already know something terrible has happened to Joe. She's been captured. She's tied up. She's being deprived of sleep. Water is repeatedly dripping onto her face. And she's being forced to watch a press conference on a screen mounted above her. The press conference is from 6 months earlier. The same period when Jo was making her decisions about Balakin. That isn't random. The episode is clearly connecting Jo's present captivity to the choices she made in the past. And suddenly, Balakin's warning becomes much more frightening. She told Jo that if the SVR discovered her identity, she would disappear without a trace. That's exactly the kind of thing that appears to have happened. So the question becomes, did Jo's decision put Balakin in danger and eventually lead the enemy back to Jo? The episode doesn't give us every answer yet, but the connection is becoming harder to ignore. The McNamara family is still suffering. While all this intelligence work is happening, the episode also spends time showing the damage Jo's career is doing to her family. Kate calls a family meeting, and she asks her mother to quit. It's a powerful moment because Kate isn't speaking like someone who simply doesn't understand what Jo does. She's speaking like a daughter who has finally had enough. Her family has already experienced the consequences of Jo's work. They've lived with the fear. They've dealt with the secrecy. And now the danger is starting to feel closer than ever. Jo's response is equally revealing. She explains that she is a soldier. She believes the freedom her family enjoys is protected by people willing to do the work she does. In Jo's mind, quitting isn't simply walking away from a job. It's walking away from a responsibility. And that creates the central conflict of her character. Jo genuinely loves her family, but she also genuinely believes her work matters. She doesn't know how to choose between those two things. The girls get another scare. The episode also shows just how much the family's anxiety has changed their everyday lives. A routine drive becomes frightening when two Cups and Randy notice a passing vehicle and interpret as a potential threat. For the adults, this might be another security precaution. For Jo's daughters, it's something else. It's another reminder that their mother has enemies. Another reminder that danger can appear anywhere. Even something as ordinary as driving through town can suddenly become terrifying. And that's the price Jo doesn't always talk about. Her family doesn't need to understand every classified operation to feel its consequences. They just need to see the people around them become nervous. Final thoughts. The Bear is Infected is a quieter episode, but that doesn't mean it's less important. If anything, slowing the story down allows Lioness to show us how this war is actually being fought. It's not always bullets and explosions. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes it's a secret. Sometimes it's a person who has been recruited years earlier and is sitting in a position of power. And sometimes it's a decision made by Jo that seems reasonable at the time, but creates consequences she can't predict. Balakin may not have exposed Jo's home address, but she knows enough about the CIA, the Lioness program, and Russian intelligence to make her one of the most important people in this story. And those 5 senators could completely change the direction of the season. Because if even part of what Balakin says is true, the CIA isn't simply dealing with Russian operations overseas. The problem is already inside the American political system, and Jo is right in the middle of it. The biggest question now is what happened after Jo chose to keep Balakin in place. Did the SVR discover her? Did someone inside the CIA leak information? Did Balakin's list of American assets lead the Russians back to Jo? Or did Jo's attempt to control the situation create the exact opening her enemies needed? Whatever the answer is, the present-day scenes make one thing clear. Jo is paying for something, and the decision she made 6 months earlier may be coming back to haunt her, because in the world of Lioness, protecting one secret often means creating another, and sooner or later, every secret gets found. This time, Jo may be the one who has to pay the price.